What happens when freedom feels more terrifying than captivity? Imagine waking up and finding the door open, but not trusting it, because every kindness once meant pain. Every face could be a threat. In 1944, behind barbed wire and silence, tens of thousands of women endured that reality, stripped of names and told they would never leave. So when soldiers finally walked in, rescue didn't feel like relief. It felt like a new danger, unfamiliar tongues, unfamiliar rules, the impossible idea that mercy could be real. This story follows those survivors, how they learned to trust, to choose, and to rebuild a life. The year is 1944. For more than a decade, the Japanese Empire had quietly built and maintained a vast, secret network of military comfort stations scattered across the Pacific, hidden in port towns, scrubby islands, and the shadows of occupation. On paper, they looked like supply depots and recreation halls. In reality, they were a sprawling, organized system designed to service troops and erase the people forced into them. It was efficient. It was bureaucratic. And it was deliberately obscured from the world. This was the machinery behind countless lives erased, a dark infrastructure whose human cost most soldiers and officials never imagined. The scale was staggering. Across Korea, China, and the Philippines, tens of thousands of young women were ripped from their homes, kidnapped in the night, promised work, or simply dragged away and shoved into isolated compounds where movement, speech, even names were tightly controlled. These weren't random captives. It was an organized industrial system of confinement that stretched across the Pacific, invisible to most of the world. Imagine entire communities emptied of daughters, sisters, brides, replaced by iron gates, barbed wire, and guards. The human cost was immense, and the silence that hid it would make their eventual discovery all the more shocking. They didn't just lose freedom, they lost themselves. In the compounds, the girls were renamed, catalogued, and taught to answer to numbers or Japanese titles. Their histories were erased in favor of a single, repeating command. Day after day, officers and matrons fed them the same brutal line. "You are here to serve the Empire, and you will never leave," said like a lesson, said like a verdict, said so often it began to sound like truth. Over time, the lie settled into bones and breath, folding their pasts into silence until the only identity left was obedience. They didn't just lock the gates, they rewired what it meant to be human. Names were erased, routines became rules, every kindness converted into a test smile at the wrong time, and you were punished, look up, and you were marked as trouble. Small freedoms were traded for survival, and survival taught a new logic: don't hope. Hope drew attention, hope brought reprisals. So the system trained people to distrust even their own wishes, replacing memory with obedience and intimacy with fear. By the time we arrive at that forgotten compound in the Philippines, the psychological cage is as real as the barbed wire. In a forgotten compound in the Philippines, a young woman named Kim Sun-hee inhabits two worlds at once: the physical one of rusted fences and concrete rooms, and an interior prison built of shame, obedience, and the constant dread of being owned. She moves small and careful, eyes lowered, hands trained not to reach for anything that isn't handed with force. Years of being told she has no choice have hollowed out the simplest freedoms: choosing a shirt, choosing to speak, choosing to refuse. Her silence is a habit and a shield. Outside, the horizon is restless. Something approaches that will soon test whether the lessons of captivity still hold. As the rumble of unfamiliar vehicles grows louder, Sun-hee freezes. Those engines don't mean rescue here. In a place where mercy had been rewritten as cruelty, every bootstep feels like a threat. Her body remembers the patrols, the orders, the way small kindnesses turned into new violence. She presses herself into shadow and waits, certain the faces at the gate will bring danger, not salvation. October 23, 1944. A convoy eases to a stop, and men spill out, rifles up, eyes sharp. The compound looks abandoned at first glance, broken shutters, a swing frozen in the wind, laundry tangled on a line like a warning. Dust hangs in the air. Every footstep is a question. Fingers hover over triggers. Radios sigh. They sweep rooms and courtyards with military precision, expecting soldiers, booby traps, or discarded equipment. They move like hunters in a ruined house, ready for violence. What they don't expect is the way silence can hide something far worse. They sweep through with rifles up, eyes darting for uniforms, for mines, for the telltale glint of abandoned weapons, everything a combat patrol trains for in a dozen different war games. But the compound answers with strange silence. No angry voices, no booby traps snapping shut, no scattered gear that might point to a retreat or an ambush. Instead, there are little, disquieting traces. A child's shoe half buried in the dirt, a threadbare blanket flung over a cot, a door padlocked from the inside. The men brace for enemy contact, and then they find something none of their training prepared them for, something that will stop them cold. They expected rifles, traps, abandoned gear. Instead, they find shadows moving, thin shapes curled against walls, faces hollowed by hunger. Dozens of young women clutch rags, too weak to stand, too terrified to make a sound. For a long, frozen second, there's only the noise of boots and breathing. The soldiers lower their guns, bewildered. These are not combatants, not spies. The women flinch at every movement, treating kindness like a new kind of danger. Hunger has made them small. Fear has made them unreadable. The discovery rips the script of war in two, leaving confusion, pity, and an urgent need to help. The soldiers had no frame for it. They hadn't trained for this. When they stepped into that compound, they expected weapons, mines, maybe a dying enemy, not an assembly line of human suffering. What met them wasn't chaos. It was design. Rooms, rosters, schedules, girls numbered and moved like inventory. It was organized, industrial. A system built to feed an army and erase dignity. For the men, there was shock. Then a blankness, no doctrine, no playbook, no language for what they'd seen. The horror registered but couldn't yet be named. A state-run program of sexual slavery, deliberate and systematic, reaching across occupied lands. To the women, these armed, foreign men mean one thing: more violence. They don't see uniforms. They see the same hands that grabbed them, the same boots that marched past their cries, the same faces that taught them to obey in silence. Years of brutality have rewired every reflex. Kindness looks like a trick. A stranger with food looks like bait, and any raised weapon is only proof the world still belongs to those who take. So when soldiers step through the gate, there's no relief in their eyes. There's only war, another wave rolling toward them, and the instinct to shrink away. Private Daniel Martinez steps forward with a tin of rations, hands outstretched, voice soft and uncertain. He expects relief. Instead, the woman in front of him flinches so hard she nearly scrambles back, as if a hand offering bread were a fist. For a beat, time freezes, his kindness misread as danger, her recoil a reflex trained by years of violence. He lowers the can, stunned. Around them, other faces tighten, mouths press shut. The small, ordinary act of giving becomes proof that rescue will not be simple. Trust must be rebuilt, inch by fragile inch. They are loaded into trucks and driven to rows of canvas tents, makeshift American field clinics, that smell of disinfectant and fear. To the soldiers, it's rescue. To the women, it's another strange place where kindness is a threat. They clutch thin blankets, flinch from offered hands, and move like ghosts into care that will soon have to reckon with wounds no one can see yet. At first glance, the damage is clinical and immediate. Gaunt faces and hollowed cheeks, rib cages pressing under skin, bellies swollen from malnutrition, old cuts crusted and new ones raw, bandages long gone, and the unmistakable signs of disease: fevered coughs, infected sores, lice in the hair, the metallic tang of blood and pus in the air. Medics move fast, counting, measuring, rationing scarce antibiotics and IVs in a tent that feels too small for the suffering it holds. It's brutal and obvious, the kind of damage a chart can track. But even as they scribble numbers, a few clinicians sense something else: wounds no thermometer will register, and one doctor will insist they look closer. Captain Helen Morrison, an Army doctor, sees what the others see: hollowed cheeks, bandaged limbs, the visible catalogue of neglect. But she also sees something the charts don't capture: the way a hand reaching for a sleeve makes a woman flinch as if expecting a blow, the brittle silence in a clinic bed where trust should be, the instinct to shrink from even a offered blanket. Antibiotics and calories and dressings mend tissue, but they cannot stitch up fear or return choice. When patients refuse to undress or push food away, Morrison understands clinical medicine is failing. These women need permission, patience, and a different kind of care. Captain Helen Morrison watched, baffled at first, then with a growing, sinking understanding. Women would stiffen if a sheet was lifted, clamp their hands over their chests, or hurriedly button their clothes the instant a medic's eyes fell on them. A tray with hot food would be set down and taken back untouched, water left to go cold on a bedside table, a gentle offer of help met with the reflex of someone dodging a blow. These weren't refusals born of rudeness or pride, they were survival habits, automatic defenses forged by years of having every choice punished, and in those small, silent gestures Morrison saw why medicine alone could not reach them. Morrison realizes these are not acts of defiance, they're the symptoms of a deeper, almost surgical damage to the self. What looks like stubbornness is actually frozen choice bodies that have been taught that saying no is dangerous, that asking is futile. She watches women shrink away from a cot, refuse food, decline a simple exam, not because they don't want help, but because their agency has been worn down to dust. The system didn't just take their names, it trained them to obey without thought. And now, as she reaches for a way to help, she meets another wall, a tangle of languages keeping their stories locked tight. The problem wasn't only that these women had been stripped of food and shelter, it was that they'd been stripped of words too, and without words there was no way to explain what had been done to them or to consent to the simplest acts of care. They spoke a tangled mix of Korean, Chinese, and Filipino dialects. Some older women clung to a hometown idiom, others answered in clipped phrases borrowed from fear. To the American medics it sounded like silence, refusals misread as stubbornness, flinches written off as rudeness, questions lost in an impossible echo. Worse, many had been forced to learn only Japanese, the language of their captors, so the kindness offered in English couldn't reach them. Until that barrier could be crossed, every act of help risked becoming another wound. Tragically, the one common language many of these women had been forced to learn was Japanese, the very tongue of their captors, and that single cruel irony turned speech into a weapon and silence into a shield. To the medics, it looked like a shared vocabulary. To the survivors, it was a reminder of orders shouted, doors slammed, and nights scored by a voice that robbed them of choice. Some girls answered in Japanese out of habit or fear. Others went mute, retreating into gestures and haunted eyes. Language, meant to connect, had been twisted into a tool of control, and now it kept them from being helped. Medics stared at charts and empty stares, and the measures that usually saved lives felt useless here. They could stitch flesh, set bones, treat infections, but how do you treat a person who refuses to be seen? When a patient won't undress, won't eat, won't answer, the instruments are powerless. The women's silence wasn't ignorance. It was a language of fear, shaped by years of control. Every test became a potential re-traumatization. The doctors had no script for this. They needed more than translators for words. They needed someone who could translate trust. How do you begin to heal wounds no one can chart or photograph? Just when the medics had run out of options and the silence felt like another kind of wound, a lifeline walked in. Sergeant Grace Kimura, a Japanese-American interpreter in a U.S. Army uniform, calm and precise as a relay switch. She moved through the cots with a translator's quiet confidence, handbook and notepad clipped at her hip, and when she spoke it was into two worlds at once. English to the officers, and Japanese, the very language these women had been forced to learn, to the survivors. It wasn't magic. It was translation. It was the first thread anyone had offered back toward a language that might bring them home. At first, nothing softens, only the same hardened fear. They press back into shadows, eyes like shutters, hands clamp over mouths. A uniform means orders. A face like theirs means danger. Sergeant Grace Kimura steps forward in an American jacket, but that simple sight rewrites everything they know. She could be one of the captors. They flinch. They shrink. Old reflexes spool out before reason can start. Silence hangs heavy, thick as dust. For a long beat, trust is impossible. Suspicion is the default language here, and even kindness looks like a new kind of threat. She doesn't rush. Kimura moves slow, palms visible, steps measured, everything about her says she won't force anything. Then she speaks, not loudly, not commanding, but low and precise in a language these women can hear without flinching. The words are simple. The sound itself is the gift. Heads stop turning. A fist unclenches. An old woman stares as if remembering the shape of her own name. The room, full of suspicion a moment before, exhales a fraction. Small, almost invisible changes begin. A lip trembles, a shoulder drops. Eyes that had learned to look away finally meet hers. For the first time, something shifts. She tells them, quietly, that she is American. The words hang between them like something impossible. This isn't a liberator who looks like their captors. For a moment, every muscle in the room holds its breath. Hands curl away, eyes dart toward exits. Then, slowly, the rigid fear that has hardened them for years begins to fracture. It's not a sudden flood of relief. It is a tiny, hesitating recognition. An eyebrow relaxes, a shoulder drops. A hand reaches toward the offered water and does not recoil. That single contradictory sentence does more than translate words. It translates possibility, and a fragile bridge of trust begins to form. Through Kimura, the medical staff begins to understand, and what they learn is worse than anything they had imagined. She doesn't just translate words. She decodes a life built on daily ritualized obedience. The commands, the punishments, the small, brutal lessons that taught these women to flinch at kindness and to give up choice as survival. The medics hear how names were stripped away, how Japanese phrases became the only language allowed, how privacy was erased piece by piece until asking a question felt like rebellion. Little by little, the pattern emerges. Systematic conditioning, isolation, and a psychological architecture designed to erase autonomy. It reframes every refusal, every silence as trauma, not defiance. Then something else surfaced quieter, almost unbelievable. With Kimura translating, the medics learned a heartbreaking detail. Some of these women had been taken so young, held so long, that their mothers' tongues were slipping away. Teenagers who should have been full of gossip and scars instead stared at questions as if the words were foreign. They mouthed half-sentences, reached for names that wouldn't come, or answered in the language of their captors because it was the only one they'd been forced to use. It was not just bodies that had been stolen. It was memory, culture, the map back to themselves. Their culture was slipping away like a song half-remembered lullabies hummed in the dark, recipes scribbled on torn scraps, the sound of a mother's voice calling a child's name, all of it thinning until it almost vanished. Girls who once spoke at home now listened and waited, unsure if the words belonged to them anymore. This wasn't only memory loss. It was identity, being worn down on purpose, an erasure practiced like a cruel craft. The system had nearly succeeded in making them strangers to themselves. To heal that, the Americans would learn that saving a life meant returning the smallest pieces of it, a name, a choice, a curtain drawn for privacy. Liberation didn't arrive with a trumpet. It arrived in tiny, stubborn moments, a nurse offering a clean dress and waiting, a soldier setting a bowl of soup down, then stepping away, a doctor who asked permission before she touched, a curtain drawn around a cot so a woman could have privacy for the first time in years. Those small, repeated acts were not patronizing charity. They were the deliberate return of choice, the recalibration of trust. Bit by bit, everyday dignity began to stitch itself back into lives that had been systematically unstitched, and with each quiet kindness, the women relearned something vital. They could decide for themselves. The nurse kneels and holds out a stack of clean clothes like an offering cotton, a faded blue dress, a plain blouse folded with care, and waits. The woman's fingers hover, trembling, unused to choice. She sniffs the cloth as if testing permission. Then, slowly, she reaches, picks one, and for the first time that anyone can remember, she chose for herself. It's a small thing. It's everything. The nurse doesn't hurry her. She steps back and lets dignity settle in the space where control once lived, leaving room for the next quiet mercy to follow. A soldier brings a hot meal, sets it gently on the tray, and doesn't hover. He steps back, no probing questions, no expectant stare. He simply walks away, giving her room to eat in private for the first time in years. That small, ordinary kindness eaten in silence begins to teach her that choices can be safe again. Guided by Kimura, Dr. Morrison changes the way she practices medicine. She stops barging in. She begins to ask softly, through an interpreter, "May I look? May I touch? Do you want me to explain?" Each question is deliberate. Each pause gives the woman time to answer, or to refuse. It sounds simple, almost petty, but after years of orders and violence, those small choices are seismic. A hand that trembles when offered food steadies when asked for permission. A scarf is lifted by the patient, not by a stranger. In those tiny exchanges, control returns in fragments. And with control comes a dignity no medicine had yet managed to restore. A curtain, a thin scrap of canvas hung around a cot, becomes more than fabric. It becomes a border between being owned and being human. Behind it, a woman can make a private choice. To undress for an exam on her own terms, to wash without an audience, to eat in peace, to weep or whisper a name no soldier taught her to forget. The act is small and ordinary elsewhere, but here it's revolutionary. Permission is asked, consent is given, and a sliver of control is returned. In those quiet, shadowed inches, the stolen dignity begins, quietly but irrevocably, to be reclaimed. Each small kindness lands like a foreign language, at first awkward, suspect, and then, slowly, it starts to make sense. A clean dress offered and left for her to choose. A nurse who knocks and waits for permission. A soldier who sets down a bowl and steps back. A curtain drawn for privacy. These are tiny reversals of a life that taught them no choices existed. They do more than soothe the body. They return the motion of decision to hands that haven't moved freely in years. The gestures are quiet, almost humble, but together they pry loose the bars of the psychological prison, and in the slackening air, trust begins to form. As the barriers ease, something unexpected comes into view. These women are not broken dolls, but a kept-back current of resilience. In polite silence, they begin to tell small stories, point to photos, teach a child a lullaby, patch a wound, barter a scrap of rice. One steadies another when a medic's hand approaches. Another slips a folded name written on a scrap into a nurse's palm. Their eyes sharpen, their shoulders straighten. Tiny acts, choosing a dress, closing a curtain, refusing to be shuffled, become deliberate reclaimings of self. Their survival was not passive endurance, but a covert, stubborn courage that had kept them alive. But the future that should feel like relief tastes only like fear. They tell the doctors and translators something more terrifying than hunger or pain. Going home. Not because their villages were far, but because home might be worse than the camp fingers pointed, whispered accusations, families who turn away. Shame is a second captivity. Some confess they would rather stay with strangers than face the silence at a family table. Others imagine being blamed for what was done to them, treated as if they chose this life. The bravery that rebuilt trust now collides with an almost impossible question. Where do you belong once your name has been stolen? For some, the stigma clings like a second prison, heavier than hunger, colder than the nights under the guard towers. Coming home would not be rescue. It would be a verdict. Hushed questions at the table, hands that pull away, a family's shame spoken in looks instead of words. Many imagine returning and see only judgment, exclusion, a lifetime of being defined by what was done to them. A few hide, change their names, disappear rather than face that next violence. The idea of home has been erased for many. Despair settles in until a memory, a whisper, or a small act of defiance cracks the silence. Just as despair sets in, their stories of the past provide the key to their future. Chong Sun-mi's testimony is simple at first. They had become sisters by necessity. Then she tells how when no one could speak a common language, they made one, a thread of gestures, whispers, and shared routines that meant, I'm with you, eat this, hide here. They swapped memories like contraband names, hometown songs, family recipes, stitching vanishing identities back together. What sounds small becomes monumental, a cup passed under a blanket, a wink that meant, I'll watch the door. Those secret acts of care were not cowardice or submission. They were resistance, and in those quiet alliances, hope began to live again. Language failed them, so they made a new one. When words were weaponized, the women invented signals of mercy, a gentle squeeze of a hand to mean, I'm with you, a tucked ribbon to mark a safe place. A hummed melody passed from girl to girl until the tune itself carried meaning. They etched codes into braids, slipped notes into seams, traced shapes on each other's palms, small gestures that stitched strangers into kin. Those quiet rituals became grammar. The promise of food, the offer to tend a fever, the warning to hide. Out of silence, they built a network, a sisterhood that learned to listen without speech and to feed, nurse, and protect one another. They did it quietly, like a language of survival. Bowls were passed under blankets, crusts traded for a handful of rice, hands smoothing hair for a child who couldn't stop trembling. Women with scabbed knuckles learned to bind wounds with strips of cloth and whisper lullabies in the few words they remembered. When a guard came by, someone would cough, someone else would drop a tray, and another would cradle a frightened girl and step between her and trouble. No formal plan, just improvisation, intuition, and fierce tenderness. Small, constant choices that stitched them into a hidden sisterhood and kept one another alive. In a place built to strip them bare, the women had quietly become a people passing scraps like currency, whispering warnings through knots in cloth, nursing each other with the furtive precision of long practice. These were not random acts of survival, but a coordinated, resilient community with rules, roles, and fierce care. When American soldiers and medics finally recognized that organization, the deliberate sharing, the secret protection of the young and the sick, something in the camp shifted. Pity turned into respect. Shock turned into responsibility. And that recognition lit a fire in the relief effort, pushing men and women to act not as saviors of helpless victims, but as partners to survivors reclaiming their lives. Inspired by the women's quiet defiance, medical teams rewired the way relief worked, not as a parade of saviors, but as a practice in handing power back. They trained doctors and nurses in simple rules. Always ask, always explain, always wait, use interpreters, honor privacy, let survivors lead the pace of examinations. Consent became the first medicine. Small choices, which clothes to wear, when to eat, who sits in the room, were treated as clinical tools for recovery. Peer support groups and survivor-led routines were folded into care plans, so healing came from within the community, not imposed from outside, and dignity began to return. Medicine could heal bodies, but it couldn't alone restore what had been stolen: language, ritual, taste, the small customs that anchor a person to a past and a people. So relief teams did something simple and radical they brought home to them. Hot bowls of familiar soups, stacks of traditional garments, elders and chaplains to lead prayers and songs, language lessons, folk music, a curtain to change behind. These gestures weren't charity, they were reclamation. Choosing a dress, tasting a childhood dish, hearing a mother tongue again, each act stitched a memory back into place and returned a sliver of choice. Cultural restoration became a medicine of its own, the bridge between survival and the possibility of returning to life. When officials finally heard what the women had been saying, the visceral terror of returning to families that might shun them, the practical impossibility of reintegration, the response shifted from emergency triage to long-term care. Not everyone could or would go home. Authorities and aid groups built alternatives: safe houses that became transitional homes, legal pathways for asylum or new identities, vocational training tied to real job placements, confidential counseling, and community sponsorships that helped stitch a life back together. Most importantly, choices were offered. For the first time, survivors controlled the question of where and how to survive. Aid didn't end with a hot meal or a stitched wound. It had to become a lifeline. Resettlement programs found safe places to live. Job training taught trades and offered a paycheck, not charity. Ongoing care, medical, psychological, legal, was made available on a long-term basis, with counselors who understood that trust is rebuilt in inches, not hours. Choices were returned: where to sleep, what to wear, whether to tell a story. For many, recovery was not a deadline but a lifetime's work, and the institutions that stepped forward did so with that humility, creating real alternatives for those who could never simply go home. When those soldiers pushed through the gates, they didn't just find ruined bodies and hollowed-out rooms, they became the first outside eyes to see what had been hidden for years. There was an initial silence, a kind of stunned shame, then the clatter of cameras and the hurried scribble of notes as men and women tried to name what they'd found. They watched survivors flinch at kindness, watched the evidence of an industry built on cruelty. That shock landed like a responsibility. These troops could not pretend they hadn't seen. They would carry those faces and those facts beyond the front lines, and the world would have to reckon with what they had witnessed. What those soldiers carried home wasn't just a story. It was ink on paper, bandaged limbs recorded in field notes, faces frozen on film-detailed reports, medical records and photographs that together stopped being fragments and became a ledger of a system. Each entry mapped a pattern: dates, injuries, locations, the same cruel methods repeated. Taken as a whole, those documents stripped away plausible deniability and gave prosecutors something very hard to argue with: evidence that sexual slavery was not isolated atrocity but organized policy. Those files would be cited in tribunals, shape policy, and, crucially, lay the groundwork for survivors' voices to finally be heard. But the most powerful evidence didn't come from papers or photos, it came from the women themselves. Some chose quiet rebuilding, small, stubborn acts of living that looked ordinary on the surface, but were, in truth, victories of survival: tending a garden, raising a child, learning to sleep without fear. Others, after years of silence and gathering strength, began to speak. Their testimonies cut through denials and diplomacy, turned private grief into public accountability, and sparked a slow, global movement demanding recognition and justice. Their voices remade the record, and their courage became the bridge between history and conscience. The shock of liberation wasn't fireworks or a single triumphant moment. It was the quiet, stunned realization that someone had looked at them and seen a person, not a thing. For women who'd survived systematic erasure, even simple kindness felt impossible. Their disbelief and compassion became a monument to the cruelty they'd endured. But that same disbelief makes their survival all the more powerful. They remind us that dignity can be returned, piece by fragile piece. Their testimonies became proof, their endurance a call. So we don't bury this history as an ugly footnote. We remember names, we teach the truth, we honor their strength loudly forever.